I would love for you to explain like the dark side of modeling and what people don't understand as far as how it impacts mental health, body image, your self-worth, etc.
It's a hard one for me to answer because I definitely don't want to start with demonizing the industry because I'm actually, funnily enough, still part of that world. Um, I think how I would describe modeling is like on the outside, obviously it's very glamorous. And there is that glamour to it. And I mean, especially when I was at the height of my career when there wasn't social media, it was kind of a very inner circle, very glamorous, flying off to different shoots, different teams, inspirational people. It was great. And I learned a lot. I learned how to communicate to different people, to adapt in different situations. And I grew up incredibly quickly. I mean, I was signed at 16, so I went into the world very, very young. But I think what I would say is it's not just the industry, it's very much going into anything at a very, very young age, into basically catapulting into a career at a very quick level. Your emotional development is really important at that age. And I think, my emotional development went from being at home in Portsmouth, which is like a really small city outside of London, to all of a sudden like coming to LA. I think one of my first shoots was coming here and staying at the Viceroy and then going to Miami. So I think like I kind of got catapulted in this world. And then for me, it was about like, how can I stay relevant and topical? And the only thing that you can do in the modeling world is how you look, right? You can't, personality is important, yes, but you're basically being chosen on your look. You can't grow taller, you can't change how you look apart from your body weight and your body size. So I think that's where a lot of the pressures and maybe the darker side of modeling can come, that your financial worth sadly is based on predominantly one thing. That's how you look. And that's very hard when you're very young and very naive and going into a very like high pressured industry of high performance.
Yeah, I think in general that industry just being a model just breeds, low self-worth, low self-esteem. You can potentially fall into the trap of body dysmorphia and just having your whole identity and level of success based on your look. And that can just, I'm sure, lead to a variety of things. And that's why I was interested to ask you that. Um,
Mm.
like, what was the day to day like for you? Like, as far as the mind games, like, what would you have to tell your? What was the inner dialogue like for you with having to, essentially, like, convince yourself that you were good enough when in reality, at times, the industry or your job was telling you you weren't. Like, what was that like?
Yeah, I think like I had a bit of a roller coaster journey with my career because at the beginning I was really fortunate actually to have a very quick career to being booked all the time. Essentially, like 95% of models that get assigned to an agency doesn't go anywhere. And I think that's the realization, right? We look at this 1% and we think, well, that's where we're going to get to. And so actually like a big load of that never make it, similar to maybe becoming into any sport, right? You get signed into certain teams, but to get to that 1%, you never really get to. But I was lucky that I had quite a quick career. And I think with that, the mind concept and the mind games was basically became quite a people pleaser. Like, how can I make sure that I don't upset anyone? How can I make sure that, I turn up to how they expect of me? And so for me, my criticism was really strong. I would compare myself to every person I went up to in a casting. I would compare myself constantly on set. And I think, comparison is known as the thief of joy. And I realize that more and more now. But for me, I lived in a world of I had to fight everyone in that casting to get that job. I always had to be that person that they wanted to pick. And so your mind games after a certain while is like, how can I get better? How can I be more? And I try and think about this, right? If you're a dancer, you can keep perfecting your routine. If you're an actress, you can make sure you learn those lines or whatever it is, like get a better voice dialect. But with a model, it's like, well, what do you do? And a lot of it turns to weight, a lot of it turns to obsession about how you look. And so I think that's where I was becoming increasingly aware of like needing to catch myself and that inner dialogue, because with every model's career, you'll have low points. You'll have moments where you don't work as much, and you'll have other models and other moments in your career where you're so in demand that you can get really stressed and burnt out, that you don't actually ever have a day off. And with those low moments, the mind obviously goes again and again and again. You're constantly then in a fear of anxiety that no one's ever going to book you again. So they're some of the hardest moments that I remember is, when I maybe did have a bit of a dip, the mind control that I was really hard.
Yeah, and you hear a lot about the arrival fallacy. When I get this, I'll be happy. When I look this way, I'll be happy. And I think it's very common knowledge at this point that the way you look doesn't like determine all of your happiness, right? Like I think you'll feel, if you look good, I think you feel good, right? I think there's no question. I think that's very healthy. But I think if you you put all your entire self-worth and level of happiness around the way you look, I think it's a trap that will be really hard to get out of. Yet so many people continue to refine the way they look, hoping that it'll make them happier. As somebody who has gotten to the place of looking like the way a lot of people want to look, how do you convince them that it's a trap?
I think there's a lot to be said in that. I think, first of all, yes, if you get up, you have a shower, you put on something that makes you feel good, you go for a run, you feel good. All of these things, yes, they do feel good. And I had to go back to COVID. I actually felt awful during COVID because I just put sweatpants on the whole time and didn't care about what I looked like. And actually that affected my mental state. So you have a certain point to we brush our teeth because we want healthy teeth. Those parts are important, but that should just be to make you feel better. The part of only allowing people to accept you on basically what you look like, which is really what I'm hearing you say, is a really dangerous trap. I don't think I realized when I was in it how bad my self-worth was, or my self-esteem. I had no idea. And self-esteem and self-worth are quite different, because self-esteem is, which now I figured out, now I'm kind of not putting all of my self-esteem on this. But self-esteem basically means that you feel better when you're doing better than other people. So when I was getting all the jobs and no one else was getting them, my self-esteem was actually pretty high, because I was you basically think that you're better, right? You're getting all these jobs. Similarly to school, if you're getting all the top grades, your self-esteem is pretty high. Whereas then when I wasn't getting the jobs, or maybe when someone's grades are falling at school, or whatever that comparison is, your self-esteem drops, because then you're not better than anyone else. And that's why actually self-esteem is quite a scary predictor to work against, because you only have high self-esteem when you're basically doing better than other people, which just is not how life is. And that's the way that I was basically programmed, I think, for a lot of that job, through a lack of self-awareness, that I was only good if I was getting everything and I was better than other people. And that's just not the reality of life. And that's just not a healthy way to live. Failure, or the realization that it's not going to be like that all the time, is really important to recognize. So when it goes just on our looks, we then only end up acting out on how we think others will perceive us. And for a lot of and the reason why I say this is because a lot of my early 20s, I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I valued. I didn't know what was important to me. I did that based on what other people's projections were. And that's a really scary way to live, because you become very disassociated with yourself. So if you're always going on what the external validation is on others, to that split second of what you look like, then that can be a very, very scary place to live. And you can lose yourself a lot in that. But sadly, I say all of that, but sadly, we actually do know that from psychology, people do make split judgments on what you look like. So it also wouldn't be the most helpful thing to me to sit here and say it doesn't matter, because we do know that the most split instinctual reaction when you meet someone new is that you're going to look at their physical appearance and how they look like. So there is a bit of a truth to understanding that certain physical appearance are important, but basing all of your self-worth on that is when it gets really, really worrying. And you devalue yourself a lot.
What was the moment when you decided to transition out of modeling full time and then go and study nutrition? What was the reason behind that? And what was that transformation process like?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was kind of modeling full time for 8 years. So I got signed at 16, lived in London from 17, and then went to New York in my teens, just before I was 20. And that's when things like really ramped up. That's when I was kind of not around my family, not around any close friends. And yeah, if anyone's lived in New York, the pace of it's pretty quick. And it's also pretty brutal. So you're in and out. And after 5 years of living in New York, my body, had basically a full breakdown for what I would now say was what is known as habitual burnout. And basically I had kidney failure, had sepsis, I had E. coli, I had lots of burst cysts. And I was basically in hospital for a very long time. And then I was also very, very low in weight. I'm trying to think of what it would be in kg, but my body had essentially just said, like, that's it, it's enough. And I basically passed out when I was on set and got taken in an ambulance to intensive care. And then about 6 months later, I went back to New York, and then my dad had a brain hemorrhage. And it was in that moment when I thought I was going to lose him and went to go and see him in intensive care, that I had this, I don't know, I guess like a moment in my own life where I said, well, this was me 6 months ago, and I haven't taken like any action to realize just like how close to death I was at that moment. And now I'm about to lose my dad. So a lot of it was the fear of losing my dad that kind of jolted me into realizing that what my body was screaming at me was actually really, really significant. So the only thing that I thought, well, what should I do? I went back to school to study nutritional science to first of all figure out how I could look after myself. And that led me down a very long hole of understanding a lot more. And so, many years later, I've dedicated everything that I do around this, actually, whether it's nutritional health, psychological health, mental health. Everything was kind of born out of that moment.
Thanks for sharing that. And I would love to unpack a good bit of that. I think what first comes to mind, I think when I was on your show, we were talking about external validation. I would love to hear what the process was like for you of developing a healthy level of external validation. I think the audience would get a lot of value out of that.
It took me a really long time. I think sometimes with these things, especially when it's with the mind and it's psychological, I think sometimes we can hear things spoken about and very quickly judge ourselves that we can't get there. I think for me, it took me a long time to not rely on external validation. I mean, I grew up in an industry that relied very much on external validation. Another part of the story that was more profound than the modeling is that I was dyslexic. So I went through my entire school life thinking I wasn't smart and thinking I wasn't stupid. And so that I always had that external validation of being told I wasn't smart. So it took a long time for me to overcome not relying on somebody telling me, you are accepted, or yes, this is good enough. And it's not until I started to really trust myself that I became much more comfortable in not relying just solely on external validation.
And then what about, like, how was your relationship with like self-judgment and self-criticism? I can imagine, like, you talked a bit about what that process was like for you as a model. Like, what was the process like for unlearning that and becoming better and not being so hard on yourself?
It's a lifelong journey, I have to say. It's not a quick fix. You know what? I don't think I realized for a very long time that I was self-critical. And I think, like, we can talk about this to a lot of people. And I think it's not until I heard Guy Roach, the psychologist, say that he actually wrote down in a journal how many times a day a negative thought would come into his mind. And sometimes I think, we all can connect to self-criticism, right? We can all say, I talk myself down on these things, but it's not until we actually become like very aware, like, so say if we set ourselves a task to be aware of it during a day, that we actually realize just actually how many times we're self-critical. And I think we have something between like 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day. And it's something around like 80% of those, I can't remember the exact figure, are critical. Wow. And so kind of understanding like that we're neuro-wired to be more self-critical is actually really, really important, because we can also kind of shroud ourselves in shame and say, well, why am I self-critical? Because obviously when we look at other people, like when I would look at you, Doug, or, when you would look at people who come on here, you probably wouldn't think that they're more wired to be self-critical. So I think for a very long time, I never spoke about it. I never was as aware that it was such a big thing. And it's probably through mostly one of all, having compassion for myself, which is something that I think about and talk about a lot through my work, which is self-compassion, which basically means that you can connect to common humanity, that we all go through these things, that I found very difficult, because sometimes I would just think, is it just me that I think like this? Is it just me that I'm going through these moments? To being kind to yourself, actually, how do you respond to that self-criticism? And for me, my self-criticism, I've just keep shutting myself down. I had no compassion around it. And I think kind of having that journey, and then having people on the show who open up their stories, and maybe this is part of your process as well, that you actually connect a lot more to having a lot more compassion for yourself. Whereas before, I would just be stuck in very strong negative loop cycles that so many people can get stuck in. And that, what I actually realized, was hyper unproductive. It didn't lead to any positive outcome. And so actually, when I had more compassion for myself, it really started to interrupting those cycles of self-criticism. And then I actually found that I had much more positive outcomes for what I was criticizing myself for. So it's a much longer process. And I don't ever think that you can, come out of self-criticism very quickly. But I think just starting to be more aware of how critical you can be is one of the most important steps. Because actually, our brains are evolutionary wired to be critical. They're not evolutionary wired to be compassionate or kind or understanding. They're wired innately to keep us away from threat. So that was a really big turning point when I started to understand the psychology behind it.
What advice do you have for somebody who might be listening to this that struggles a lot with criticizing the way they look, criticizing their appearance, self-judgment? What are some things they could do to kind of, transcend that into something more positive?
It's a really good question, because what I would first of all say to somebody who is struggling with this is, one, we all struggle with it. I'm sure people might have looked at me when in my height of my modeling career and gone, well, she hasn't got any self-criticism. And trust me, that was my most critical period of my entire life. So first of all, connect that actually it's completely human and normal to be self-critical, but you can change it. You have the power to change your self-criticism. So what I would first of all do is actually write down what's in your mind, actually put pen to paper. So we know when we have a reflective process of actually putting it down, it dampens that self-criticism quite quickly. So writing down the things that are going around, ruminating in your mind, and they're probably similar things that come up. And so you'll first of all start noticing patterns. And I think that's a really important first step to working with self-criticism. And then when you're looking at all of the things that are coming up that you feel very critical about, you can start asking yourself, are they true? Do I really believe these? If I was to call a friend, would they agree with what's on this paper? And that's a really, really good way to start thinking about it, because people in your life are friends with you for a reason. And would they think about these things about you all the time? Or would they maybe say something different? And so I think that's one really first positive step, is to write it down and reflect about it on paper. The next thing I would say is, which can be really, really hard, but really helpful, is when you have that thought, stop it in your mind, write it down, stop it, write it down. Every time you do that, you're going to connect to how quickly these thoughts are coming in and out. And that's also a really, really important way. The second thing I would do is then write down, after these things happen, 3 things that you're really grateful for, because this actually helps with the neurowiring in your brain to start switching it into a different pathway, to start actually seeing other things in your life that you're grateful, maybe taking it away from yourself as well, which is really, really important to do. And then the third thing I would say is, self-compassion is something that I talk a lot about, but people can find that really hard to connect to. So I talk about it in self-kindness. And I say that because it's a really good kind of antidote to the self-criticism lens. So thinking about all of these things that you say to yourself, that you see written down on paper, what would you then say to a friend who said that to you? How would you respond? Would you say, yeah, I kind of agree, you're all of these things? Or would you say something that's way more compassionate and understanding? And because you could probably easily say to a friend, you can start doing it in that way, but then you can start reversing it on yourself. And that's a really, really powerful tool to start getting into. It's a lot of this reframing and reprogramming. Because don't forget that for a very, very long time, these neuro pathways have been heightened in going very quickly towards this self-critical aspect. So it's harder to go the other way, but trying to write it down, stop, and then reframe. And sometimes it's easier to think about if a friend was saying it back to you, are some of the most kind of helpful tips that I could think about for a person to start.
Yeah, I think the hardest battle, or one of the hardest battles people will go through in life, is how do they fight like the head trash, the mind games, and it's often a journey that you have to do alone, because nobody can change the way you feel about yourself, right? You can only do that.
I was also just thinking, like, just getting up and going for a walk is sometimes like the most helpful thing.
Yeah.
Or getting up and changing, because if you're sitting in a chair in the same place, everything's staying in the same mechanism. Literally getting up and going for a walk, or getting up and calling a friend, or getting up and putting on some of your favorite music, you need to be able to try and like self-regulate yourself into a more positive frame of mind. And that is sometimes just literally moving environments. And even that small thing can have a profound effect.
I would love to get your thoughts on this. You left full-time modeling to study nutrition science. You have a podcast that focuses heavily on health, wellness, longevity, science, etc. How have you learned to like bridge the gap between like exercise and nutrition for like vanity, like kind of like looking good, and also like longevity and health?
I would say that a really large part of why I started the show was because I didn't believe that there was ethical, scientific information that was also quite empowering to people that I was around. I just didn't feel that there was anything out there that, one, empowered people, but two, was from scientific rigor. And I think, like, there's been a lot of change in the past few years around the communication of health. When I was starting it, when I was starting studying science, the only platform that I remember that was available to me was Goop, which was not science-based. And I found like so many of those articles 10 years ago really detrimental to my mental health and my reasons for the outcome of why I was wanting to eat healthily. So for me, we don't talk too much about the vanity purposes at all. I mean, we actually never do. For me, it's about the conversation on what can one do on all of these different dimensions of health to make them just feel better. And the whole, like, the name of the show is Live Well, Be Well. And if you live well, you will be well. That's like my ultimate philosophy. And that's so different for so many people. For instance, like, we'll talk about exercise, but there's so many different types of exercise that is important for a different type of person in a different lifespan, or where they are, whether they're in their late 30s, mid 40s, early 50s. It's going to be very different for each person. And I think sometimes we can have a very reductionist view of health. And I think that's something that I'm very eager to kind of fight against, that actually it shouldn't be reductionist. It shouldn't be elitist in any sense. And I think there did become a part within health that became very elitist, and you had to have a lot of money to look well and be well. And, I believe that so much about living well and being well for me starts in the mind, and it's the mindset. And it's not just the external thing that we can move and we can eat. If we don't feel well in our minds, and we don't have the motivation, and we don't have the mindset to want to feel better, then we won't. So much about the conversations for us, and for me especially, is really tapping into the mindset. Because I believe that when you can do that, behavioral change naturally occurs.
You got into modeling before social media. Now with social media, there's like cheat codes, right? You can add filters, you can edit the photos. What do you think it's done to people's like sense of self and the way they view themselves, given they can just post a photo, edit it to make themselves look completely different? And there will be many people that don't even know the difference.
So I don't think it's affected the modeling world at all. But I mean, that's not kind of my main world anymore. I would say the bigger question that I would answer there is, what's the impact on direct filters on today's generation? And I'd say it's huge. So I speak about this a lot in the fact that when I was modeling, it was a very specific, tiny little world that, unless it was in the press, that's the only snippets that you would see. And you would very much, like the average person would maybe look at a magazine and say, oh, I want to look like that. And there would be some retouching and some editing. Now, what can happen is that anyone feels like they're in the modeling world. Every day that you open up social media, you are comparing yourself to somebody. You don't know if it's a real photo or not. Very much known that if you look at a picture in a magazine, you're going to know it's probably retouched. That's been known for years. Now you can open up any social media account and you don't know if that's been retouched, if it's got a filter, how much that filter is, how realistic that picture is. So you're basically in direct comparison every day with an image or a world or a life that you don't think is real. And it's not just the perception of what that person looks like. It's how they're living their life, the glamorous sides that they're only showing you of that life on social media. And that's what I think is a really big similarity between when I was modeling and today. Is that like every single person now can relate to what I went through 15 years ago, because that's basically what you're going through today. Selfie wasn't even a term, I think, 8 years ago. And now it's in like the dictionary of taking pictures of yourself. So the bombardment that we have of comparison from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep is huge. And the amount of filters, like when Snapchat took off and TikTok and Instagram, it's very rare now that you'll see somebody post a picture that's not got a filter on. So every day you're seeing probably a retouched picture. So I think it doesn't impact the industry that I used to be in, but I think the biggest impact is on the everyday person who now it's not looking at a model's retouched picture in a magazine or on, in GQ or in Vogue. It's literally opening up your phone and feeling a lack of self-worth. So I think that's like a really big impact that we might not be aware of, but one that I think is important to be aware of.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Snapchat at all for a variety of reasons. And I think that, I think I saw something, was it last year? I don't know if you're familiar with this, where somebody actually got plastic surgery to look like a Snapchat filter. Did you see that?
No, but I have a friend of mine who is a cosmetic surgeon in London. And she's very strict about like what she would ever do. And the rise in pictures that comes in of a filter and people are like, I want to look like this. And that is terrifying. Like it's terrifying that people are bringing in pictures of filters and wanting themselves to look more like a filter, which is just really sad because I think, aging can actually be a really beautiful thing. Maturing and aging can be like a really empowering thing. And sadly, we are wanting to do everything in our power to disacknowledge like the evolution of aging.
What advice would you have for a parent to have conversations with their kids about what's real and what's not real as far as looks on social media?
Well, first of all, I'd say if your kids aren't old enough to know what social media is yet, try and keep them off as long as possible. Because as soon as they get into that world, that's really detrimental. I don't think there's any positives about being online when you're a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see one. And honestly, if it wasn't for my own job, I would not be on social media. If I didn't have to promote the show and to engage with all of the great people that are out there on the show, I personally wouldn't be an ex. I think, the new word that got put in the Oxford Dictionary this year was brain rot. That being on social media literally rots your brain. So the fact that the word of 2024 was brain rot from social media, we don't want to be rotting our children's brains from a young age. Having said that, I have a niece who is 13 and who is dying to get on to social media and is having constant arguments with my sister about trying to get on there. And so it's very, very hard. And I don't want to shame any parents that do struggle to not get their children off social media, I think putting a timer on the phone is really important. Doing it where you can observe what they're doing is also really important. You know, going to their room and scrolling endlessly and not being able to sleep is not healthy. So I think giving them like very limited time on the phone is probably one rule, and having it on like a parental mode. I think the sad thing is this is going to be the first generation that has had access to phones before. And so we don't actually really know what the outcome is. All I think is that everyone is going to agree is that it's going to be more of a negative outcome than a positive. So just restricting the time as much as possible that they can have on that phone. And I just think, like, I don't know about you, Doug, but like getting kids outside. Like I grew up playing outside in the street, and I just feel like that is such an important mechanism of health and of sociability and creativity. Like I worry that kids' creative output is going to be blunted from not having these moments of boredom or making imaginary games with, I don't know, my teddy bears. That's what I used to do. And I feel like that's all being blunted now because children have constant access to social media, which is, you know, hitting their dopamine levels and their attention like nothing else.
Do you struggle to eat enough protein every day? Essential amino acids are what's inside protein that builds muscle and healthy hair, skin, and nails. The aminos from Kion ensures that you're getting all the essential amino acids from protein that your body needs. They contain more essential amino acids, are absorbed easier, and can be better at building muscle than protein. I've been taking Kion aminos for several months, and they have been especially useful on the days where I'm back-to-back with interviews and clients. As someone who is obsessed with building muscle, I am constantly making sure that I'm getting enough protein. Kion aminos helps me make sure that I'm doing that, and when I take them, I feel energized and secure, knowing that my body is getting everything that it needs. I love the aminos from Kion because they contain all 9 essential amino acids, while some other brands only have 8. Their aminos also have a transparent formula with exact amounts of each essential amino acid and ideal ratios that are backed by over 20 years of research. So if you want to give Kion aminos a try, you can use my link to save 20% at getkion.com/adversity. And to make things better, they also have a 60-day money-back guarantee. So again, to get 20% off, go to getkion.com/adversity. Now back to the show.
Are you familiar with Michael Easter's work?
No.
You should read The Comfort Crisis. Highly recommend. It's an amazing book. He'd be a great guest as well. I'm summarizing this, so I don't know the exact words, but he said something like, the things that we used to do for fun as kids, like our parents today would never let their kids do in many ways, right? Going outside and, you know, walking to a park and, you know, playing outside for hours and hours and like riding their bikes through the woods, like just the things that, you know, we, like you said, we grew up doing. And, you know, a lot of that now has been replaced with technology. And because of that, you know, I think it's caused kids to not be good at problem solving and to not be good at being creative and thinking for themselves, because, you know, a lot of that requires you to engage your mind, engage in conversation, engage in like thinking and where you have to go. And now it's been replaced with a screen, which in many ways does all the thinking for you. And not to say that phones are bad. I mean, I make a career, my career is made off of technology, and I think it can be very healthy and beneficial if you use it properly. You know, I think there's the old term, it's like you're either a creator on social media or you're a consumer, right? You know, you're either creating content or you're consuming content. And I think if you can spend more time in a, you know, either creating or learning on social media versus just scrolling and just consuming like all day, every day, I think, you know, overall your brain will be in a better place, because you're right. Like there is, you know, research about what social media does to your brain. And specifically, you know, with kids, when their brains aren't developed, I'm sure it's a definite net negative. But,
Yeah.
you know, with all that said, like, you know, technology is here. It's not going anywhere. I just think that people have to learn to use it like properly and not, you know, and do their best to not fall into some of these traps it can present.
Yeah, I think that's just the difference with kids, right? I mean, if I was a kid and I had an iPad or a phone, I mean, I would have been all guns blazing and gone in, but I mean, it just wasn't around. So, you know, I think it's more about the parental advisory with children. And I mean, the rates of ADHD and ADD and all of those things, like the neurodivergent, I mean, I'm dyslexic and I have my niece and nephew are autistic, and I have a lot of friends that are ADHD. You know, we know that there are certain things that you can do to support neurodivergent brains, but also we know that people are also getting symptoms of ADHD because of their obsession with phones, because it's a constant distraction. And so, yeah, I think one of the healthiest things is to like give yourself like a timeout from the phone. Because I don't know if you have this, but I don't know if you sit in a waiting room. Say if you're just sat in a waiting room, what would the percentage be for you, Doug, to pick up your phone and look at it, as opposed to just sit there and allow your brain to creatively go somewhere? Like, we're so uncomfortable with just sitting there and not reaching for our phone. And I think that's, I think that is really important to challenge yourself with. It's like, go for a walk and don't take your phone, or go somewhere where you don't need your phone for like an hour. Because we have this like natural reaction to pick up our phone whenever we're bored. And I think that's like killing a lot of creativity, like creative thinking processes.
Yeah, you'd love talking to Michael because he talks about that in the book as well, as like one of the things that we've lost the ability to do is to be bored. And that was like used to be like a beneficial thing back in the day. Like you had to like, walk for a period of time to like hunt, and you had to like kind of just be bored as you're like searching for food. And a lot of people, their biggest ideas came from a place of boredom where they had nothing else on their mind, and just the ability to like just sit and be present with yourself. But it is hard. I mean, I can't, I would be lying if I said that I am great at that. I mean, I'm always pulling out my phone if I'm in line, or, if I see a text, come through while I'm doing something. It's just, I'm not.
Can I give you a challenge this week?
What's the challenge?
And then can you write to me about it?
Sure.
So every time you're in a queue, or like you're sitting down, like you're waiting for something, like you're actively there, so you're in an appointment, or like, I don't know, you're waiting for something for the gym, do not touch your phone. And I think like even having like a natural response of, I was going to touch my phone, now I'm going to put it down, we'll see like how much we rely on that source for entertainment, as opposed to allowing our brain to naturally creatively think.
Yeah.
Can I try? Can you do that for a week and then mess?
I will, and I'll email you and let you know if I was able to do it.
But I'd love to social experiment with you, Doug.
What's interesting you say that. Like I remember, I think Andrew Huberman was saying that. I think when he would go, if I'm butchering this, I'm sorry, Andrew, but I think he said something like when he would like go for runs, in order for him not to be distracted with his phone, he would like count how many times he didn't pull his phone out when he wanted to, and it was like a game for him. And that's how he like got better at doing it. So I think there is something to be said to like kind of gamify it a little bit and to challenge yourself and see if you can actually like do something. Because it is hard, and you're almost like, it's like now it can be kind of awkward if like you're in line somewhere, you're by yourself and the person in front of you is like there, and you're like, I'll just pull out my phone and avoid being awkward, not saying anything. But I also think that
you could even say hi to them.
Right, exactly.
Remember the good old days when you used to like speak to people in queue.
Right. Well, the other thing I was saying too, which I think there's a lot of truth to this, because I feel like whenever I don't have my phone, somebody needs me. It's like Murphy's Law, where like, I leave my phone. I'm like, all right, I don't need my phone. I'm just going to like leave it here for like a couple hours. And then all of a sudden, like somebody really needed to talk to me. That I think there is this, because we've been so conditioned to communicate through the phone, which if you're not communicating with your phone today, you're essentially like lost, because I mean, how are you regularly communicating with people these days? Unless you're like living with them or, in an office or something, but that you assume that if you don't take your phone, there's this element of fear that's like, well, what if something happens? What if the off chance that, I leave and I go out, go get coffee for my fiance or something. I'm like, I'm just gonna leave my phone here. And then what if I get into a car accident? Or what if like, I'm going to be like 30 minutes late because the line at the coffee shop was forever. I don't have my phone. I think
How do you think people dealt with that 20 years ago? How do you think people dealt with that 20 years ago?
Well, I mean, I think 20 years ago, they just assumed everything was going to be okay. But I think the problem is we're not 20. It's not 20 years ago anymore. We've learned behavior to have this level of, I don't want to call it instant gratification, because that's not what I'm getting at. It's more like knowledge at your fingertips and being able to communicate something instantly. And something, of course, with a phone, I think that on the other, you think about the other person, like you're like, if I don't have my phone and they try to get a hold of me, I don't want that person being like super worried or scared, right?
Well, I guess what I would say in that moment, right, because I'm trying to think about how it would be helpful for you, is there will probably be like 1 or 2 people in your life that you would probably have as an emergency dial. So maybe your partner. So there could be that thing of, I'm going to go out for a walk for half an hour and say to your partner, I'm not going to take my phone, to give her the awareness. I think if you can try and create a reduced friction for your, like, for the worries that could come up. And then I would say, like, I don't understand. This is how I talk to myself. I'm trying to say like what I do, because I have for the last year been really aware of my phone usage because I think it's killed my productivity. So I've really tried to put in boundaries. And I'd say, like, as well as telling the 1 or 2 people in your life that if there was a crisis, but if you were also, I don't know, in a podcast now, or you were giving a talk on stage, you also wouldn't have your phone for an hour.
Right.
And so I try and think of these moments of, actually, there are moments where I don't have my phone. Like, I've not looked at my phone whilst I'm on this podcast to you because I want to be present and I want to be engaged. And this is something that's important. So you have my full focus.
Right.
Now, if I come off this podcast and I look at my phone and there's an emergency, do I feel guilty about that? Like, I can't be available 24/7. And obviously, if I know there's an emergency, I'll react to it. But I don't think we can live our life from now how the world is catered that we should feel that we're available 24/7. Similar as you're sleeping, right? You go to sleep, something could happen, but you won't know if you're asleep. But you can't live your life not sleeping because you're worried that somebody couldn't get hold of you. So I'd say, like, on those moments where you should have half an hour away from your phone, I try to think about it in that way, that actually the amount of times that there is an emergency is quite small. And there will be maybe times when there's an emergency, well, I could look at my phone after this and see maybe, I don't know, 4 missed calls from someone, but I'm not going to look at my phone while I'm on a podcast to you.
Right.
So I think it's about trying to like actually have that internal discussion with yourself.
And I think there could potentially be like a happy medium for people, you know, where they're like, all right, I'll take my phone with me, but I'm only going to like answer phone calls. I'm not going to look at texts. I'm not, because, you know, if somebody really needs to get a hold of you, chances are that you're going to get a phone call, right? If you don't respond to a text, 2 texts, 3 texts, some time goes by, like you're going to get a phone call if it's really important, right?
Those good old things.
Yeah, that's kind of become ancient these days too, right? Would have been the top like 2 or 3 biggest lessons you've learned about health and wellness that you think people like need to hear?
Oh, it's a good question. It's really hard. I don't know if you have this with your show, Doug, but you sometimes leave and have some of the most profound conversations. And then 6 months later, you can't remember it because you're distilling so much knowledge through.
Oh, I black out during interviews sometimes. I mean, not like legitimate, not like, but I like my mind like blacks out because I'm so like dialed in at the same thing. Like I'll be like, somebody like, what'd you guys talk about? I'm like, I honestly don't remember.
Even in the moment, you're like, where am I?
Yeah.
So I get this thing where I wish I had a better memory of all the things. And I do try and write down notes after each guest about the things that really stuck out. But I think, so we've done over 300 episodes of the show. Some of the biggest ones, I mean, I absolutely loved Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's like one of the top neuroscientists in the world.
She's amazing. She studies like emotions or whatever. Yeah.
She does emotions. And I have to say, I thought I was pretty weird on this subject. I kind of came in with some really like interesting questions. And I don't think I spoke for most of the show. I was just in complete awe of her. She articulates her information really well, but she basically was talking about like how our emotions are all predictions and how we predict our emotions. And I found that really interesting, and how she talked about body budgeting. So for instance, poor mental health, she's like, a large variety of it is because our body is in a body deficit. And so we actually need to be looking maybe similar to Chris Palmer, but like, what are the other things that are happening? But how she talked about emotions and how we predict our emotions, I found completely like mind-blowing. And so I would definitely say, like, either listen to the episode or just go and listen to her work on how our emotions work, because you realize how much more power that you've got, because everything that you predict, everything that you see as an emotion is what you've already experienced. So she doesn't talk about them in isolation. She talks about like every emotion you get is already a prediction or an experience of what happened. And that I found like really profound, of how much we can actually take control of our emotions. And I would say The other one, I mean, I absolutely loved Dr. Chris Palmer, and I found that really emotional when I had the conversation with him around our mind and our mental health, and how our diet can really influence our mental health and our mind state, which is something that I work a lot in. The other one that I would say, and I'm really trying to think because there's a lot, but is I spoke to Simon Sinek this year on my birthday. It was actually my birthday. And it was a really big one for me because I'd gone through a really intense 6 months before that conversation of a relationship breakup that came out of nowhere, that hit me like a ton of bricks. And what saved me was my friends. And I'd never done a conversation within the vicinity of health, that was talking about the power of friendships. We had Dan Buettner on from the Blue Zones, and we spoke about community and purpose and all those type of things. But we'd never spoken about the importance of friendships on health. And actually, the thing that saved me through that 6 months was my friends. Like, it wasn't getting outside. It wasn't giving myself an affirmation. It wasn't going to therapy. It wasn't anything that I tried to do on every vicinity of health. It was my mate. It was my friends that got me back to better health. And I remember having that conversation with him on my 35th birthday, which felt a very profound birthday for me to have that. It was one that I didn't want to have. I didn't want to have that birthday at all. And him talking to me about the power of friendship. And I remember saying, in all the episodes we've had on the show, we've never done one on friends. And actually, this is probably the most significant thing that's helped me through the stage of my health right now that's so important. And he gave some really amazing tools and exercises to do to kind of help your friendships grow, and actually how they are as important as romantic relationships. So I will always remember when he told me about the 8-minute rule. And I don't know if you've heard about it.
I haven't.
So basically he was saying that it's really important that we can have friends to call, but like, how often do we call them when we're in trouble? And he said he had one friend that kept messaging him, and he saw her a couple of months later, and he said, "How are you?" And she said, "Well, I've not been great, actually." And he was like, why didn't you reach out to me?" And she said, "I did." And so he was like, "Well, I'm going to immediately look at my phone." And he said, "Well, this is reaching out." And he showed her 2 text messages where it said, "Hey, how are you? Like, are you around tonight?" And he didn't respond. And then she next and said, "Hey, do you fancy dinner or something?" Or like, "Hey, what's up?" And he said, "These are cry for help." And she was like, "Yeah." And he said, like, "This is not a cry for help. This was just, I just thought you wanted to grab a dinner." And so he made up this rule, which was 8 minutes, where he said, like, I never want my friends to feel that they can't call me, or that I don't know if they're in trouble or they need to speak to me. So he said to all of his friends, text me 8 minutes. Everyone has 8 minutes. We have 8 minutes to step out of a meeting. We have 8 minutes to, if this happened now, I could stop it and literally answer a call for 8 minutes. If I know what you were saying is an emergency, you have 8 minutes to speak to someone. And you're not going to solve the world's problems in 8 minutes, but you're going to give them some attention and say, I'm going to call you when I get out of this board meeting or off this podcast, and actually give you the time that you deserve, and I'm here for you. Because sometimes it can be so hard to reach out to someone if you're feeling that you need to speak to them. It's very hard to distill everything that's happened into a very short message. So having that 8 minutes is really profound. And since then, I've used that 8 minutes, and I've had friends use that 8 minutes to me. That being like a real integration from the show that I took, and one that I think isn't spoken about enough. So they're probably like three of my favorites.
And hence why it's important to have your phone with you at all times.
Yeah. But I've never had anyone message me in a podcast, thank God.
Well, Sarah, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for your vulnerability, for your time. I think the audience is going to really enjoy this conversation.
Thank you. I hope so. Well, I hope it was helpful.
Totally helpful. Thank you again.
Thank you.